Okay, so I think this is recording. So this is my good friend Lauren Clem, who lives in Hong Kong. And so I'm just going to ask her a couple of questions. Well, there's more than a couple of questions. You guys are going to have to bear with us to get to know Asian culture as well as her experience living overseas in Hong Kong. So I guess I can remember, Laura, how long have you lived in Hong Kong now?
Almost 8 years. So I'll become a permanent resident in the fall.
Wow. So when you first went, I thought that you went in the beginning to teach English as a second language, or well, I guess it was their second language, but to teach English.
Yeah, as a foreign language. Yeah, I kind of did. My parents actually moved here while I was at JBU. And so, yeah, after I graduated, I originally just moved here. I was pretty much planning on teaching, but it was more just to kind of live with them and experience, something new. So I did. So I taught for about 5 years. And then for like the last 2.5 years, I've been working at an NGO, which is actually a Filipino NGO.
Hmm.
So I get to have that fun culture as well. And we have a very like international office. So we have people from kind of all over.
What's kind of the work of the nonprofit?
We work with like the ultra poor. So basically, that's the level below extreme poverty. So I guess it's about like 50 cents a day, like people who survive on about 50 cents a day or less. So I think, yeah, our average participant is actually less than 50 cents a day. So we kind of try to do like holistic education. We kind of work through the local church and pastors to run like training programs that will teach like how to earn money, like business skills, health knowledge, the gospel, good relationships, like, arrange surgeries. Like it's pretty holistic. So
Wow.
yeah, so that's what we do. And I do reporting for them. So I'm mainly like writing and pictures.
I did see one picture where it was the world's tiniest little vehicle, and one of the pastors had crammed all the boxes in. I guess he was taking
Yeah.
to people's houses, or what was just distributing food for them.
Yeah, it's the situation's like very serious in the Philippines right now, like because the medical system isn't really set up for COVID. So because of that, the government's being like very strict about it. And so pretty much everyone's like stuck inside. And yeah, it's just really strict. So many people, they kind of like basically whatever they earn, they use that to buy food that day. So because of that, it's kind of like mass hunger right now. So we're basically using our pastor network in order to distribute food because like our staff can't always get the permits because again it's so strict, so you can't really cross borders, you can't go from one town to the other unless you have a permit. And so one of our strategies has been to have the pastors, we have like a emergency response network because we have about like 9,000 pastors in our network, so it's pretty big. um, so they'll like kind of message our local staff. We have 10 bases throughout the Philippines, and it's pretty much Visayas and Mindanao. So like the lower part, the middle and lower part of the Philippines. And they'll kind of like message our local staff, and then they kind of arrange a pickup. So they usually try to get like the local officials to let them borrow some vehicle and then come however many hours to our office to try to pick it up and then distribute it. So that one, I think the picture you saw was a tricycle. So that's what they call them. So they're, yes, very small. I think for Americans, we would probably say like 1 to 2 people can fit in there. But of course, they cram lots of people in. And yeah, I think that particular pack had like, I don't remember how many. It was, yeah, it was like 100 or so like boxes of food in there. It was very full.
And so most of the work that you guys are doing is in the Philippines, but the office is just in Hong Kong.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, but basically it was like started in the Philippines just by some pastors who wanted to help. But then it got connected with Hong Kong because Hong Kong and the Philippines are connected as far as there's a lot of Filipinos who will go to Hong Kong to be domestic workers, so like maids. Um, so one of those domestic workers was talking with her employer and told her, oh, my brother's a pastor and like they have this person who needs surgery. And she ended up paying for that person's surgery. So that's kind of how it started, and it just kind of became a big organization. So now it's like the Hong Kong office, we do like majority of our fundraising here, but now we've like we've expanded into the US and Australia, and I think like our CEO and executive director from the US. So it's kind of like a mainly American culture office. But of course we have like Filipinos, and then, you know, of course local Hong Kongers work there as well, and, you know, Korean, Indian, like now African, because we're actually expanding into Uganda. So we have 2
Wow.
Ugandans who joined our office this year.
Very international.
Yeah. Trying to live up to the name, International Care Ministries.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. So I was thinking about like just if you could tell the students a little bit about why you kind of had a heart for the Asian people, because I remember even back whenever I knew you, you already had this heart to work with Asian people. Like what kind of how did that develop?
um, I guess I wouldn't have thought. I think when I knew you, that was actually after I had lived in Hong Kong. So I
Mhm.
think that's kind of where I knew, like, that's definitely, you know, where God was calling me. But I think before that, it probably started more in college. Like I knew some Asians, like when I was in high school,
Mhm.
like some Asian Americans and then some exchange students. But you know, I don't think at that point I would say I was had a heart or anything. You know, just friends. You know, so I didn't really think too much about it. Um, and I think it was at college. Like, I had some pretty good like Korean friends, and then I roomed with one of them as well. So I always kind of thought I would like maybe end up in Korea.
Mhm.
And I almost did, but God told me to come back to Hong Kong instead. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's just yeah, and then of course since my parents moved here, we had that connection. And then now my sister, she also moved here, and then now she's in Taiwan as a missionary. So yeah, I guess we're almost all here except my brother.
Yeah, he's still in Alaska.
He actually moved to Utah, so
Okay. So I was
but yeah.
wondering, like, when you, I mean, maybe you could think back to even the first time you went to Hong Kong, but also when you
Mhm.
moved there. What were some of like your culture shock experiences? Like, what kind of stands out as like, wow, that was hard or different or.
Mm, yeah. The funny thing is like didn't have so many big shocks, I think. Like I think it's more just like, you know, as you go, you kind of just run into things. You're like, oh, that's different. And I think especially Hong Kong, because Hong Kong's like it's, you know, tends to be very westernized.
Mm,
um so because it was a British colony for a long time, and then, you know, it only like went back to China like, you
mm,
know, 20 years ago or something. So it's, you know, it's been pretty westernized. Like English is an official language. But yeah, I don't know, I think when I first moved here I was more shocked like as far as just being like big city life, because
mm,
I was from a small town. Like my hometown's about the same size as Siloam. So I
mm,
think like trying to figure out, you know, all the buses, because there's like, I mean, it's probably the best public transport in the world. um but it's like just figuring it all out. Like you have trams and minibuses and big buses and ferries, and they're all, you know, and the subway, and they're all going different places, you know. So I think that was hard. And then of course the names,
mm,
because I think for a while like just trying to figure out, you know, Wan Chai and Chai Wan are not in you know, anywhere close to each other, you know. So it'd be kind of hard for me to remember
mm,
Cantonese names. um I think a lot of the other stuff that was like surprising again kind of crept up on me, because I think you don't always, again, because it's, you know, tends to be a little more westernized, like you don't always notice the differences at first until you're like, oh, that was different.
mm,
Like I think I remember one that was memorable was I was watching, so I've been, you know, studying Cantonese for like 6 years now.
mm,
um so I like to watch a lot of YouTube to try to learn. So I was watching this video, and in the video it's like about this girl who's like 20 something, and she was like dating this other 20 something guy.
mm,
And then she like also is dating this like older man at the same time, and like the older man will like buy her lots of stuff and like, you know, take her to nice restaurants. And then at the end, like the younger guy catches her like with the older guy, and then they're both crying and stuff. And then the younger, and she's like, oh, I'm sorry, you know. And then the younger guy was like, okay, let's get married then. And I was like, whoa. I'm like, I heard that wrong. And I would like rewind it and listen to it again. And then I'm like, no, he can't be saying that. And I'm like rewinding it again. And finally I like asked a friend and I was like, I don't get this. Did he say let's get married after he caught her cheating on him? And my friend's like, oh yeah, actually that's normal. It's like a lot of people think if you have a problem in your relationship, then like the way that you can fix it is by upping the commitment. And I'm like, whoa. I'm like, I would not have thought of that. So I feel like, sometimes it's things like that. Yeah, it just kind of like creeps up on you. Or like maybe another thing is like I guess just like how you handle conflict. Because again, most of the time you're not having much conflict with people like in your everyday life. But I guess like something I just learned is, like you just don't tend to be direct about it. And this is something I think, say my sister, she deals with this more. Because again, I think it's all a spectrum. I would say Hong Kong people are like in the scale of Asia, they are more direct than Philippines would be or than Taiwan would be. But I think they also would be much less direct than like Americans would be. So I think generally, if I have a problem with someone or like, maybe I need to be honest or like express my feelings or something, but that's not really always like the best way to go, here, like maybe you should talk to a friend to like talk with the other person, things like that. But, and even things like, as far as, I still forget about this actually, and then people will remind me sometimes, is like, same thing with being indirect is maybe they won't necessarily say no to your face. And again, like Hong Kongers, I think are a bit more direct, but they still sometimes don't do this, but Filipinos definitely are much less direct. So if they'll say like, oh, maybe we'll come, well, in my mind I will always think like, oh yeah, I have like 5 maybes to this party and then like 10 yeses, and then other people like, no, maybe is a no. They're not coming. Oh yeah, that's right. I keep forgetting about that.
How many of them would say yes and just not come?
um I mean, some, but I don't know, I feel like most of them would probably come if they said yes. I think it's more like they just wouldn't maybe say no directly, but they might, like they think they're saying no. Like a very common thing like is if you meet someone and then they're like, oh, we should hang out sometime, and they'll be like hachi sina, like, oh, next time first, and then that basically means no, but it's saying like, yeah, next time, we'll hang out, but everyone knows that that actually means no. So
It's funny you brought that up because I asked a question in here about, so in counseling, the few Asian Americans I counseled in the States before coming to Spain, I found it very hard to have them answer direct questions that were like emotion related. And so I really had to find myself talking around whatever it was I wanted to talk about. And so I kind of asked, one of the questions I prepared was if you felt like that was true about things that were more like emotionally heavy. How do you ever get around to talking about those things, even if it's just like a close friend that you feel like you want to support them? How would you approach talking about it?
I mean, I think it just takes more time. Like I personally, haven't had, I mean, I think there's definitely some people that are not open to, talking at all. But I would just say, like, I think it just takes a lot more warm up. I feel like we're a bit more open, like with anyone, like we'll even talk to strangers and stuff. And I feel like that's not really a thing. And so I think it just does take a lot more time, like I know my sister, she had gone to a counselor in Taiwan, and she was saying that like actually the counselor, the entire first session, even almost 2 sessions, it was literally just getting to know her and her background. Like she didn't ask anything about why are you here or anything. It was literally just getting to know her, and then also kind of sharing a little bit about herself so that they could have like yeah, a good rapport so she could trust her. So I think it just takes time. I think you're right. Like sometimes you do need to ask kind of indirectly,
Mm,
and then like I think for a lot of things that try to ask many questions to lead up to it instead of just like asking it very directly.
mm.
So yeah, I would say that just take time, talking about other things first, ask different questions. Yeah, and come at it at different angles.
Mm.
Like if they don't really say something right away, then maybe try to rephrase it or even talk about other people, or something first, right?
Do you feel like it when you look at like kind of like your friends, because that what the Taiwanese counselor was doing in counselor language is just building rapport with the client. But I'm curious if you would have a different way of building rapport with an Asian client than building rapport, say, with a North American client. Like, our typical questions are, where'd you go to school? And what do your parents do for a living? What's your favorite restaurant? Or things you say to
Mm.
people you're trying to get to know. Like, have you found it to be different in Hong Kong, like the things you would talk
Mm.
about in the beginning?
Um, Mostly I think it depends a little bit. Like for example, it depends on the crowd. So I think the more, because with Hong Kong, of course, there's, different crowds. And I feel like the more like westernized ones, or like maybe ones who've studied overseas or work in like an international company, I feel like it's very similar, like talking about those things. But something I noticed, like if I like to go to concerts. And so I have a lot of like friends who I would say are, you have like more local or like, local. So I feel like most of my local friends are from shows. And in that one, I think you can talk about your job, but it's not, I find like most people don't really want to talk about their job much. Like it's okay, but I think, and maybe it's just because I think here it does seem a little like hierarchical in a way, or like it's a very like striving culture as far as, there's a lot of pressure. It's a very high pressure culture, like very competitive. And so I think sometimes it can come across like if you're asking what their job is, like you're trying to like judge them, or like, and let's say they're like a construction worker, or, they work at 7-Eleven or something. If you're like asking them that, then they might feel like you're judging them or something.
You're trying to figure
So
out how much money they make and what economic status they have.
yeah. So anyway, I did notice that. I think a lot of the other questions to get to know people seem to me a bit similar. Well, actually, the thing that I mainly noticed, which I don't think this would help you in a counseling scenario, but people just like, it's just hard to get to know people. But this is how I'm not culturally appropriate, as far as like I'm not following the culture, but it's still appropriate, is because I do talk to strangers.
Mm,
Like I talk to people in my building all the time, or like if I'm at a concert, I often will talk to people. But that's not really a normal thing. And I think it's because I'm a foreigner, they kind of expect it. And then also female, so I'm not threatening. So I think like I can get away with it. Yeah, I can get away with it. But and then, I can make friends that way. So it's nice. But generally I have found, yeah, if people here talk to strangers, like if strangers talk to me, now I am usually wary. I'm like, either they maybe are really into like, foreign culture, or they want to practice English, or they're just weird, and creepy. So that's kind of what I've learned. I guess another thing is maybe try to avoid physical touch. I mean, again, I don't know in counseling how much you would, but maybe like even like a touch on the shoulder, I probably wouldn't. I mean, unless you like know the person. I think it's a very not touchy culture in general. Well, in some ways it's more so. Like I do know like say female friends might like hold each other's arms and stuff. But in general, I think it seems to be pretty not touchy.
mhm. Which is interesting too, like at the personal space. just in Asian cultures, I've always been curious because there's no personal space in Spain or Central America. There's no personal space. Like expectations, most people talk to you very close, and the greetings are very warm, lots of hugging and kissing.
Yeah.
And yet in Asian culture, it's still collectivistic culture and there's limited personal space. But I've always been curious if that's more just because they're living in big cities and they're used to having to be in smaller spaces. Like somebody I knew that used to live in Singapore talked about how it was the least amount of personal space, but she always felt like she had personal space because of the
Mm.
way the people like averted their eyes and they didn't talk to her because she was a stranger. So she actually felt like she had more personal space, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, I do think it is true is that I think there, like a lot of people have a sense of, at least in Hong Kong, and I mean, it is different, I'm sure, like, because different countries, you have variations, but at least in Hong Kong, it is extremely crowded. Like, I'm sure India and Sri Lanka are more crowded, but I've never been to a more crowded place. Like, I went to Tokyo and I thought, oh, this will be more crowded, but I went to like the most crowded place in Tokyo. I'm like, nope, less crowded. But yeah, and so I think because of that, because it is just so crowded, like, yeah, I do think people try not to get involved. Like some Westerners who move here will kind of complain about like, oh, people don't hold doors open for you and stuff like that, but I think, psychologically, if you have so many people that you have to be thinking about all the time, I think it can get overwhelming. I mean, like, if you just walk down the street, it's like you're playing Frogger, like you'll probably bump into someone, or like everyone's trying very hard not to touch each other. So it's like, but it's difficult, right? So I think it's just, yeah, I think it's a psychological thing. You just kind of have to create that distance,
It's
and
very
even like,
because in the collectivistic concept of cultures, like most Asian cultures fit like the majority of the things, like putting society and their family above themselves, and even studying things that would be better for their country or their society instead of choosing the career that they most want, or and then even India having arranged marriages because that's best what's for the family. So you kind of see this, but then like the personal space thing is the one area, well, and probably time as well. Like I'd say more aid, well, not India, but Hong Kong is probably on time, I'm guessing, because the British influence. No?
they're pretty on time. I mean, like, it depends on who you're comparing them to.
So like show
They're
up
compared to
10
Americans,
to
are
15
actually less
minutes,
on time.
10 to 15 minutes late, or
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'd say like 10 to 15 up to an hour, but depending on the person. I
oh,
mean, like, I'd say like
an hour.
events and everything, like events will definitely, but okay, like say concerts. It's like quite normal. If it says 8 o'clock, like maybe it'll be 9, because just people are always late. And so I think they do tend to be late. I would say 15 to 30 minutes is quite normal for people to be late. So, but
It's interesting
as
how
far as like,
that not all of them fit together. So you still have like the uniqueness of each country. So you could
yeah,
be like, okay, these countries are collectivistic in general, but not every single thing is going to be the same. And I think that's where I was going with
yeah,
personal space, because Central America, South America, Spain, all these like warm culture climates are, if you're walking down the street in Madrid or Barcelona, a big city in Spain, and you touch somebody, it's actually like normal for you to then look at them and say pardon. Or here in Andalusia, nobody looks at you and says pardon. They just pat you on the back and
yeah,
say hola, like it's expected that they're going to touch people, and that's a normal thing. And even in the grocery store, people touch me all
mm-hmm.
the time in the grocery store. Like it's a common thing if they walk by that they're going to pat me on the back, which doesn't bother me at all because I don't have personal space. But it really drives my husband crazy because Argel, he likes to have his
Yes,
personal space. So
so that.
strangers touching him is not something he enjoys, you know.
Not
But it
ideal.
kind of
Yeah.
sounds like he'd do okay in Hong Kong because people may brush past him, but they're not going to intentionally touch him, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess as far as like what you're saying about like the collectivist mindset, I find it's very interesting because it is a little paradoxical in a way. And it is different, like I've noticed, say, like China versus Hong Kong.
Mm.
So, like, I think when you say like collectivist, a lot of it is like collectivist on the family, right? But not necessarily on the society. Or it could be, but it depends on what you're talking about, you know?
Yeah, I'm probably gonna
So,
have to send you the lecture. So I do like a whole lecture
yeah,
on individualistic versus collectivistic. So
yeah.
within
Because even,
collectivistic aspects, there is the society, but then there's also personal space and there's time
yeah,
orientation and there's, you know,
yeah,
let's see, what else did we go over? Oh, the what you just talked about, high context or low context communication, which is the indirect versus direct
yeah,
communication. So there's those variables, but I think the overlying thing is really that, do you consider like the society to be more important than your individual rights? And
yeah.
so in
Well, and that's where I would say a
individualistic
lot of
is
them,
the opposite.
yeah. I think a lot of them like would say the family is for sure. But like for example, like helping strangers, like in China, helping strangers is not a thing, really. I mean, not I shouldn't say totally not a thing. There are definitely kind people who will help strangers, but it's definitely much less common. And
Mhm.
so it is a little more like if someone wants to help you and it's a
Mhm.
stranger, like you have to be a little careful, like maybe they're gonna scam you, you know?
Mhm.
Um,
Would you say
yeah, so I don't know.
Hong Kong, like in general, helping strangers isn't very common?
Hong Kong, I think it's more common.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, especially I think with the recent like protests and, you know, just all the stuff. Like actually I think they tend to be, I don't know, that's why it's kind of paradoxical because sometimes it seems like, yeah, don't care, you know, you can't care about other people. And so sometimes you're just like, oh, okay. But then sometimes like a lot of people are very helpful to other people. So it's I don't know. Like I can't ever like I don't have really a pattern for like when it's helpful and when they're not. So,
So,
but
but
in general here
the
they're
most
fairly
important
helpful.
thing is their family.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, that would be more important.
So, what's like, this is an easy question. What's the general way that you would greet somebody you don't know there?
Like in what context?
Like, somebody's like, oh, this is my friend Laura, and this is so and so. How do you greet them? Like, we shake hands in America and Spain,
Oh,
we give two kisses. How do you greet
oh,
somebody?
I see. I see. If someone's introducing me, I would usually just say hello, and then you have to say like hello. That's the Chinese way to say it, and then you just kind of nod at them. I think if it's like business, if it were like a business context, I think they would shake hands. But
Mhm.
generally, yeah, we don't really touch each other. We just kind of nod at each other, look at each other. I mean, honestly, like even names, it's not, that's something that kind of drives me a little crazy, I guess, because like I feel that I think this is also the American side of me because I know some British people are not like this either. But it's like I really want to know the person's name who I'm talking to. And if I don't know their name, then I like if I've been talking for a while, I feel uncomfortable.
Mhm.
But here, like that's not necessarily true. Like people could like I like if let's say if I'm with a friend, I think I would consider and so another friend came up, the first thing I would do is like introduce them,
Mhm.
but that's not really necessarily normal here. Like some people will do that, but it's not really expected. Like often a lot of the time I'll be with a friend and they'll be talking with someone else and just like never introduce me ever. So that's where I'm doing my like foreign thing where I'm like, hi, what's your name? um so yeah, I don't know, I find that quite interesting. I mean, even like you could be having dinner together and sit there for like an hour and then still never have like been introduced, or like the person across from you doesn't necessarily introduce themselves.
Would they consider that? I mean, I know we said we established that you're a foreigner, so you can get away with saying what's your name. But if it was
Yeah.
another person from the culture, would that be offensive to us? the person's name before the person that knew
I
them
don't
introduced them?
think it's offensive. I just don't. I just maybe it's just not as important. That's actually a good question. I should probably like dig deeper as to like why. I never really thought about like why it is. It just kind of is, you know? But yeah, I don't think like people aren't offended like if you ask. Like I think it's fine. And eventually they do, but sometimes they don't. Like I asked one of my friends, like I have a pretty good friend and then he has another friend and I was asking, "Oh, your good friend, what is his girlfriend's name?" Because like I kept running into them. He's
Mm.
like, "I don't know." And I'm like, "You don't know your good friend's girlfriend's name?" He's like, "No." And like they, you know, it's like his good friend and they've been dating for like 2 or 3 years or something. And I'm like, "What do you call her?" And he's like, "Oh, just sister-in-law." And I'm like, "What? Okay."
Do they sometimes do that with names? I remember my friend that was from China that lived here. The lady that runs like the store up the street, she never knew her name, even though she used to
Mm,
babysit her son, because she only called her boss woman. That was like a typical
yeah.
name to call somebody that runs a store. So I asked
Yeah.
her one time, I was like, Shinley, what's that lady's name that runs the store? I'd like to be able to greet her by name. And she's like, no, no, you call her boss woman. And then she explained it to me how to say it. I was like, I'm never gonna be able to say that. She's like, oh, well, you probably wouldn't know how to say her name anyway. But it wasn't
Yeah.
important for her to like know the name. She called her like by
Mm,
this other nickname, basically.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's quite common. Like, there's all of these names like you call every older man, you know, uncle, and like older woman. You can call like her older sister. It's nicer, you know. Like even if they're like 40, should be aunt, but you just call her like older sister. Or if you're older, this was a funny mistake. Is like I always was hearing people call like waiters like. If you're in a restaurant and they're trying to call the waiter or waitress, they often are like, "Oh, hey, handsome guy," or "Hey, pretty girl," to like get them to come over. Like, "Oh, Leng Jai, Leng Loi," you know. So like I started doing it, and then my friend was like, "Laura, you can't do that. They're gonna think you're hitting on them." And I'm like, "Yeah, but like everyone does." And they're like, "Have you noticed the age of the people who are doing that?" And I'm like, "No." And it's true. It's like 40 or like 50 and above. They like do that. But, like
So
younger
you
people
could
don't
call
really
a
do that.
handsome guy to somebody that's like older than 50. But if you
No,
said,
like the older people will be the ones who use those
oh,
terms.
who did that?
So yeah, so they just call like everyone that. Like I get called that a lot too. They'll just be like, "Oh, hey, pretty girl, like what do you want?" But that's just like a normal thing. So it's
Huh.
just like a nice thing, you know. It's kind of nice, you know, to get called that. So,
So can
but yeah, they have like
you, huh?
huh?
You go ahead.
They have all kinds of nicknames. It's true. And like besides like the you know, aunt or uncle or like, you know, fat boy is like kind of a normal nickname. They're kind of a little harsh
I
sometimes.
don't know.
Or like
Americans would really be kind of sad about those kinds of nicknames for themselves.
yeah. That's what I find funny is I think it's like they're very like indirect about a lot of stuff, but like not really about personal appearance. So yeah, they could be
Mhm.
like, "Wow, you're fatter than before." I'm like, "Thank you." It's more
Thank you.
cushion. But anyway, I'm like, what's that spot on your nose? I mean, like, personal appearance is like not necessarily like out of the question.
Oh my,
So yeah, like fat boy is like a normal nickname, or like I don't know, like random ones. Like I know someone named like Crab Stick or like Mouse is like one of my good friends, and then also the other interesting thing is I guess to know like to use their full Chinese name is kind of like a big deal. Like it kind of seems like very like deep or something.
mm,
So actually a lot of people in Hong Kong use English names because like you kind of have a bit less um it just seems like a little more distance and like more casual and kind of nice, you know, to
their
have
full Chinese name is personal.
yeah, it tends the full name because of course like you have the family name and then you have a two-part name. So the full to like tell someone the full name, that's like a little kind of a little deeper, I guess. And then they often make nicknames up like if they have a Chinese name because now I know more like local people So if they speak English, it's quite likely that they probably have an English name. Not necessarily, but I'd say like 80% or 70% of the people who speak more English probably have an English name. But then like if they don't speak English, then probably not. But they often will take the second part of the two-part name and then make that into a nickname. So like, so my Chinese name is like Gum Hoi Lam. So Lam is like the last part. So then my nickname would be Alam. So they just put like an ah on the front. This is a Cantonese thing, not a Mandarin thing. But it's, yeah, it's very normal. So you would be like ahin, you know, whatever, a wing. Those are all like, and those are still nicknames. So
It's interesting. So has the Cantonese been pretty difficult to learn?
um yeah, I mean, I guess so. I don't really like to think about how difficult it is because it's difficult. So I mean, I know it's difficult, but I just don't think it's very helpful to like think about it being difficult. I think the hardest thing, I think the language itself is difficult, but it's, I think the harder things are like psychological and then environment. So I think a lot of people here, like, it's not really that normal for like expats to actually learn it because, again, they're like, oh, it's so hard. It's like this, you know, one of the hardest languages in the world or something. So they're always like, you know, they don't want to. And then because so much is in English, like, you can get by without it. So there's not that many people, I think, who learn it or at least learn it to a higher level. Um, so because of that, I think before, now there's actually a lot more materials. Before there was like very few materials. So it was kind of like hard just because of that. Another problem is like, especially when you're a beginner, you have to get over the beginner hump because people are not the most patient and they're not necessarily, they don't really want to like sit there and listen to some beginner try to like speak, you know. They'll just switch to English like right away, like if you make a mistake within the first like sentence or two. So yeah, I think at first I had to like talk to lots of like security guards and people at 7-Eleven and like the people who don't speak English so I could practice. And then now I don't really have that problem in general. But yeah, when you're a beginner, it can be hard. So I would do like language exchanges and stuff to try to, you know, get over that, get over that hump.
That you tried to learn the language and can speak.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's probably like too much sometimes. So, you know, you just say like one word and they're like, wow, so good. And I'm like, I literally said one word, you know? So it's like too much, I think. But you know, it's nice, I guess. But I think the other problem, which I don't know, it's like the spoken and the written are different. So it's like quite kind of annoying, I guess. So like if you were to watch a movie, the subtitles on the movie don't match what they're saying, um, because the difference is so big. Thankfully, again, it's like, especially in Hong Kong, it's becoming more popular to use. Like they do have a writing system for the spoken, but it's considered like very casual. So thankfully it's becoming more popular, especially as like, I don't know if you know seen the political situation as they're trying to like differentiate more. Now it's like more popular, especially for younger people, to be using the Cantonese characters as opposed to the like Chinese characters. So it's helpful for learners.
Well, that's kind of the, I know you mentioned the protests, but I think there'll probably be some people that watch this that aren't that familiar with Hong Kong's like history or why the protests were happening. Can you tell us, like, just in a brief way? I know it's hard to summarize what was
Whew, yeah.
happening.
Okay. Very briefly. So as I said, like, you know, Hong Kong was a British colony. And in 97, the UK decided to like give Hong Kong back to China. And they basically created like an agreement because even though they were technically giving them back, they were like, well, it's going to be kind of, we still want them to be more free. And like, we want them, because, you know, we don't want them to go back, like losing all these freedoms that they had before. And actually, like, you know, there was a ton of immigration, like around 97. So like a lot of Cantonese, like Americans and Canadians and Australians, a lot of their families like went like immigrated in the, early 90s or like late 90s, because they just didn't know it was going to happen. And so anyway, they had made like a constitution, like an agreement, between China and the UK, kind of saying, Hong Kong can still have free press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, blah blah blah. They can, like, and they were working a plan to get them democracy as well, and so that was kind of all agreed to. So, but the agreement only lasts for 50 years. So I think at the moment you can kind of think of Hong Kong a little bit like Puerto Rico. So it's kind of like it's under America, but it's not really the same, and it has its own government. And in fact, I would almost say it's like probably more separate, because like, if we're in Hong Kong, I can land and I don't need a visa. But if I go to China, I need a visa. And people in China, if they're coming to Hong Kong, they have to get visas.
Mm.
So it's like separate. We have separate money,
So if
different.
we came like as Americans just to visit you, we wouldn't have to get a visa.
Yep, you can stay for 90 days. So, and then if you want to extend, you just go to Macau, which is a similar situation to Hong Kong, but smaller. But that was a Portuguese colony. And then you just come back again. It's like an hour trip, and then you have another 90 days. So, but basically, so I moved there in 2010. So pretty much before 2008, China pretty much left Hong Kong alone. And so then the people were starting to be like, oh, well, this is nice. Like maybe things are going to work out just fine. And then, like over the years, like in 2010, like it seemed pretty okay. Like when I lived there the first time, like there was like a few, grumblings or whatever, but most of the time, like people seemed okay. And then when I moved back again in 2013, I could actually like feel a pretty different environment. Like I think the Chinese government had been wanting to like kind of have more control. So one thing is like immigration, like there's about like 50 or 150 mainlanders who will immigrate to Hong Kong like every day.
Mm.
So that's a lot. And it's so crowded already. So of course it's like causing, and most of the ones who come, a lot of them are very wealthy. So they're kind of buying up the property. And so it's just causing the prices to go through the roof. And then tourism and kind of like they see encroachment like in our government, as in a lot of influence. And then basically when there was supposed to be a vote, they were like, well, you can vote for the people that we choose. And then they'd be like, no, that's not democracy. So that kicked off a bunch of protests in 2014, the umbrella movement. And then that was not successful. And that was a very peaceful movement. And then now the current movement was over an extradition bill where people could get charged, which potentially could be like speaking against the government, and then they could get potentially sent to China. I think like the idea was like, oh, if someone commits a crime in China and then runs to Hong Kong, well, then you can send them back. But then anyway, it's kind of too complicated to get into. There's a lot of things that went with that. But basically, people were very upset about it. And you had about like, there was an estimate of like almost 2 million people who like were protesting in one day. And that's about 7-ish million people. So that's like a massive amount of people protesting this. And, if you think of all the old people and the kids and the people who have to work and stuff, that's a massive protest. And then that kicked off and then the government was still like, no, we're not going to do that. Because I'm sure they can't, I'm sure the Beijing government won't let them. But anyway, so that kind of kicked off a bunch of like more violent protests overall. Like, and so now it's been 6 months. So it's like 6 months of like protests like every night. It will be almost every night of the week, like all around Hong Kong. And I'm never scared of the protesters because in general they have been getting more violent, because I mean it has been like 6 months, but like there's a lot of like police brutality of like trying against the protesters. And then in the past several months, I think the protesters have been trying to up the game. Like fewer of them want to be peaceful because they feel like it doesn't work. So a lot of them are kind of, because of before it was mainly just like blocking roads and like maybe vandalizing and things like that. And then now it's kind of amping up. And of course, because of COVID, then everything died down. But now that like we're kind of going back to normal pretty soon. Like we haven't had any new cases in like over 2 weeks. So we're pretty sure the protests will come back soon.
Mm. Oh.
Yeah, I almost even got caught in one because there was like a very bad incident that people were very upset about. There's basically like a couple hundred gangsters who like charged this actually sorry, that was a different incident. Too many incidents. There was a bunch of anyway, there's a couple hundred gangsters who charged an MTR station and then beat up a bunch of people in the MTR station. And then like the cops just never showed up for like hours. And finally the fire people were like, oh, you can call us next time, like if they don't come. So you're like, yeah, that's pretty fishy. And then they were getting people who were coming back from a protest, but of course all the other people. And then another night, this one I was going home, there's another protest, and then the police stormed an MTR station, which is the subway. And I was almost there. I was like, oh, God's protecting me, because I would have been in that station, except I ran into someone randomly and just talked to them for about 10 minutes. And so that delayed me enough that I was just a couple stations away when my train was stopped. And they're like, oh, there's an incident at Prince Edward. And then, yeah, basically they had stormed the trains and were also just like beating people. And later they're like, oh, it's our professional ability to see who's the protester. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Those people are like wearing white shirts and they're like cowering on the ground. And anyway, so yeah, it's not a very fun place at the moment.
Definitely gonna be praying for you now for your safety.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm gonna have to go because I set it for an hour, but you have 5 minutes to ask my last question, which would be if you could give like one piece of advice to the counselors about just counseling Asian people in general, what would be kind of your advice? You know, thinking about it, that the majority of the people in my class have mostly been raised in the United States and coming from a North American culture, like what could they, what kind of advice would you offer?
Yeah. I think actually what I would probably advise is a little bit more for interacting with Asian Americans, because I think here, like, I have a lot of friends who are like, you know, Canadian, American, Australian, British, Asian, and I think, and I feel that's probably a little more of like who you might be interacting with, and I feel like just something to keep in mind, I think, when you interact with them is that I think you don't want to other them. So I think that's something that a lot of like they kind of have in common with each other, is that they often feel like out of place, or like if they grew up, especially like in a more like, you know, Caucasian dominant area, then they might feel like people are often saying like, oh, where are you from? You know, and like not really saying that they're like real Americans, you know.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, yeah, just saying, you know, saying little things like that, or like, oh, your English is so good, you know, or, you know, things that are really annoying. And I think that's why I think it's good to be sensitive, even to things that, like, if you're not, you know, like if you're Caucasian, maybe it's something we would think is normal. Like, for example, I would think if I'm with a friend, I would think it's pretty normal to ask, like, oh, what are you? You know, like, what's your ethnic background? But I think like it's a bit loaded if you're asking someone who could have experienced like racism, or, you know, always been questioned. So I think it's probably better not to bring that up. Um, and even as far as like saying how much, you know, their Asian heritage kind of affects them, I feel like that would be better to just kind of leave it to them to bring it up, you know. So as far as like, because maybe they're for, you know, first generation or second generation and it really affects them, right? And if it does, then that probably will come up in your sessions. But I mean, maybe they're like fourth generation, you know, which is the same as me on my dad's side, you know. So like then I don't think they would be, you know, that influenced by it. um I guess something to keep in mind is like if they are like first or, you know, second generation or something, you know, like raised in the States, but their parents are from another country, then they probably are, you know, have experienced some feelings of like, you know, being torn between two of like, you know, when they're at school, then they're very, you know, American, like they know a lot of those, you know, like the cultural things, but then maybe their parents don't understand that, or like might be pushing them to do different things. It seems to me that a lot of them are very mixed. Like some of them would say like, oh, I'm such a banana, I'm so, I'm like not Asian at all. And then others would say, oh no, I'm like super Asian,
Mm,
like I'm very influenced by that. So I think just when you meet someone, just like let them bring that up to you, and just like kind of, I guess, and I guess that can apply to anyone, right? Is like
mm.
no one likes to be kind of put in a box just based on like their upbringing or like what they look like. So
I
just kind
like
of
what
let
you
them.
said. I liked what you said about making them feel other. Everybody
Yeah,
wants to feel other.
yeah, uh-huh. I think that's probably, not really an issue if they are a foreigner, like if they are in like a Asian from Asia necessarily. Because like just like me, I am a foreigner and I'm very, aware of that. So that's a little different. Um, yeah, I mean, I think probably just what we talked about in the beginning of just give them a lot of time.
Mm,
Don't be too pushy, I would say. Just
mm,
yeah, take things slowly. Let them trust you.
mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you, Laura, for joining me for the interview. I'm sure that they're going to appreciate getting to see us chat. There were
Oh,
a couple of
hopefully.
times I was like, oh no, I'm probably just going to get on a random conversation here with my friend Laura. That's why we tried
I
to
know, right?
keep it going. So God bless you, and I'll be praying for you there too. And I'll
Oh,
talk
well,
to you
thanks.
later.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. Bye.